To start with, I'm going to share the big picture with you of the conventional retail environment in South Africa, because we always have to understand online retail in the context of where conventional retail is at. So total retail in South Africa last year was 751 billion rand. Then the retail growth rate is the other reality check in terms of conventional retail. It's very small. It averages around 7% a year, sometimes even lower, sometimes a little higher. But that's a very low growth rate given that inflation is around 4 or 5%. So the real growth rate is only a couple of percent. In other words, traditional retail is stagnant. This is the global picture to give you a sense of why we're not unusual. 6.1% growth last year globally in conventional retail compared to 7.5% here. So it's pretty much the same situation, and that's the backdrop to the online retail scene, because online retail is always going to be a subset of traditional retail. Let's look at what shapes the online market first. This is the mobile market, which is a critical component of the internet user base in South Africa, but not necessarily of the online retail base. So, for example, if you have a look at the totals in the fifth batch of bars, you'll see that we reached 80 million mobile connections in South Africa in September last year. Clearly, there aren't 80.2 million people in South Africa using mobile phones. The actual number is around 42 million. So it's about 80% penetration of the entire South African population. In fact, far higher than the adult population of South Africa. So it shows how many kids actually have cell phones and how many probably non-South Africans have cell phones in South Africa as well. But the real gap between those two numbers, the 80 million and the 42 million, is partly dual SIMs, but it's not as big a phenomenon in this country as it is, for example, in Nigeria. The real difference there is made up by what they call today the Internet of Things and what they used to call machine-to-machine communications. So SIM cards, for example, in tracking devices. And this is the smartphone picture, what smartphones make up of those numbers. So I'm showing a forecast for 2015 as well. The number for 2014 is around 19 million smartphones in use in South Africa, of which 7.4 million are Android phones. So Android is less than half, but in the coming year it will become more than half of the smartphone base, out of a total of around 24 million smartphones in use in South Africa by the end of this year, driven very heavily by the low-cost smartphones coming into the market. So where we tend to see the top end of the market, the iPhones and the Samsung S5s and S6s and the Sony Xperias, the real shift is happening at the entry level and at lower mid level with those low-cost phones. It's a pricing and affordability issue. It's not about which is the best phone on the market. So that's what it adds up to. The number of internet users at the end of last year in South Africa, 16.2 million. Expected to grow this year conservatively to about 18.5 million. Bear in mind the number of people who have the potential of going online will be about 24 million. But affordability keeps it down to about 18.5 million, but it keeps shifting. The numbers keep changing behind this model, the digital participation curve. Just because there are 16.2 million people online does not mean that there's a potential to sell online to 16.2 million. You have to understand that people have to gain confidence in the environment before they're willing to buy online. And the new users of smartphones certainly do not have that confidence. They barely have the confidence to connect to the internet. They have to become exceptionally comfortable with the environment before they're going to even think about making a purchase. And that's what the digital participation curve represents. People who've been online for 5 years or more who then are comfortable enough to consider making a purchase. And this is what it looks like. As I say, it keeps changing because the number of internet users keeps being adjusted based on what we know versus what we expect. So we're always pleasantly surprised when they come out higher. But what happens then is if this year's number is higher than what we had anticipated, then the participation curve 5 years from now will also be higher. But the current participation curve is not affected because that's the number of people who were online 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, 5.3 million people were online. And therefore, right now, or at least at the end of 2014, the number of people with a propensity to purchase online is 5.3 million. The fact is, though, that the big shift has happened. Just have a look here again. Look at the green bar, the digital participation curve, and look at the year 2013. That's the inflection point for online retail in South Africa. It's the inflection point for digital participation. That's when it begins climbing and climbing steeply. So it has begun. So without further ado, here finally is the headline findings. The big numbers. Online retail is expected to rise by 26% in 2015, and it should reach 7.5 billion rand in 2015. Sounds big, it's actually very small. 2016, 20%. 20% is massive relative to the 7% we're getting in traditional retail. And as the base gets higher, the growth rate has to come down. In 2016, then, it should reach 9 billion rand. And the significant thing there is that total retail in South Africa is, at the end of last year, at 751 billion rand. Growth of 7.5% for the past 5 years. But the important thing here is that in 2015, it will reach 807 billion rand. And in 2016, 867 billion rand. So the real headline finding for us is that online retail in South Africa finally reaches 1%. I'm quite excited about finally being able to see it reaching that tiny little landmark. Once it reaches that landmark, if it keeps growing at those kind of rates that we've seen, then we should see it reach 2% in a lot less time than it took to reach 1%. This is the growth rate. So you can see the big year was 2011, 40%, but that is off a very low base. And 2013 was probably the most significant year where it was already off a much higher base, but the growth rate is starting to rise. And 2014 at 35% was a massive growth rate, considering that a growth rate should fall every year as the base gets lower. This is the global picture to give it that context again. Retail e-commerce growth globally is actually an important indicator of where South Africa is going to go in the next few years. So look at the red line and the percentage change each year. So for 2014, they saw 22% growth. Not too far off where we are. 2015, 20.9%, very close to where we are, which is 26%. So in a way, our online retail environment is normalizing in terms of growth rates to global trends. And this is what the actual numbers look like. So end of 2014, 7.5 billion rand. End of 2015, projected at around 9 billion rand. I think it's important to note that just 3 years earlier, 2013, we were at 4.4 billion. And 2016, we're at 9 billion. So in just 4 years, it's more than doubled. So despite what seems to be a falling growth rate, the actual curve of rand spend is growing exponentially at the moment. So now we go to the e-consumer. What does the consumer look like and how many are there out there? And the important stat to remember here is how many people are ready to purchase online. So firstly, the total number of online shoppers in South Africa at the end of last year, 3.225 million, which is actually higher than we had expected, because based on the participation curve, 5.3 million people who have a propensity to shop online, of which 3.2 million are actually shopping online. So in other words, 60% of those who are ready to shop are actually shopping. Of the total internet user base in South Africa, that makes 19.9%, just on 20% of internet users are actually shopping online. And then of the adult population, that's people aged 15 plus and excludes deep rural. Of those people in cities and towns in South Africa, 23 million, 13.8% are shopping online. And of the total population, only 6%. What we're seeing is a normalization of shopping across age groups. And by that I mean that a similar proportion of people in each age group is shopping online. So when you look at the total of 13.8% of the population, of the adult population shopping online, you don't see a dramatic or significant statistical difference between the age groups until you reach the 65 plus age group. And I must stress that that age group comprises the smallest number of actual users. And then this was quite a fascinating one. Firstly, looking at gender, there is a difference between males and females. Males are more likely to shop online than females, but not dramatically more. But the really interesting one is when you look at their marital status, is once people are no longer in a partnership, that's when they start really shopping heavily online. Obviously, income is significant. Education to some extent, but not major. And you can see a dramatic difference between those working. If you're not working or unemployed, it drops dramatically. You might say, well, obviously, because you're not earning money, but not necessarily, because there are a lot of cases that buck the trend. And an example of that is the student. So look further down. In full-time education is at 14%, versus if you retired at 10%. Let's look at the categories of shopping that are most likely to succeed in this country at this stage. And it's very small. Bear in mind that overall percentage, again, of 13.8% of adults shopping online. So this is a percentage of adults in South Africa, not of people shopping online. So in other words, 3.6% of adults in South Africa buy music and videos online and make business purchases online. The two in red that are highlighted are not purchasing behavior. They contrast between purchasing and free use of those services. So for example, downloading music, 4.1% of adults download free music, and only 2.4% download paid for music. So it shows the gap between the two and the potential to up the proportion of people buying music online. And then just perhaps to dwell very briefly on a few other categories. Gifts, very big, and then clothing. Clothing we've always found to be the biggest category in terms of number of sites in South Africa. But what it shows is it doesn't lead in terms of the number of people shopping online. And that's clearly because the basket size is that much bigger. And the same applies to groceries, which is a lot further down at 2%. And books, you'll see, is around the middle of the table, whereas in the past it was the biggest one. So let's move on. What I refer to as the digital dilemma is more about how you convince people to pay for products in the digital environment that previously they were willing to pay for when it was physical, but they don't trust the digital equivalent. So this is physical music sales versus digital sales from 2005, when it became obvious that physical sales in the United States were collapsing. And the industry here was saying, what should we do about it? And they looked at the numbers and they said, well, let's not do anything because it's working for us. We're fine. And they were proved right the year after, 2006, and again the year after, 2007. And suddenly they came to the edge of the cliff and they began falling down the cliff. It doesn't quite look like a cliff, but I promise you, in terms of profits being made in the industry, it is a cliff. And the industry is being decimated. And that's because the industry didn't see it coming when it was quite obvious it was coming. And if you take this graph and you compare it to the digital participation curve, we can anticipate that digital music sales in South Africa will increase dramatically in the next 2 years. But by the end of this year, it looks pretty respectable, $32 million in an industry that's worth about R1 billion. And suddenly it becomes an appreciable proportion of this industry. And this is a positive picture compared to what's happening in the newspaper industry, by the way, or what's about to happen. Every category has different dynamics. This is content broadly. This is the number of people who have a propensity to buy content online. We're reaching an inflection point right now where it will pass the 1 million mark next year. And that's a kind of critical mass that makes it worthwhile marketing and selling to those people. So having said all that, it highlights 3 essential rules of online retail in a market like ours. Certainly across Africa, this will apply very strongly. My favorite stories from about 10 years ago was when one of the big retailers came to me and said, "Where are we going wrong?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, we just can't seem to grow our market." So I said, "Well, let's start at the beginning. How do you segment your market online?" It was just to get a sense of their approach to the market. It wasn't a trick question at all. And they acted like I'd thrown them a massive curveball, and they said, "We don't segment our market online." And that was the basic problem. Online, people assume that the market is homogeneous, that everyone is the same, everyone wants the same, and everyone acts the same. And in fact, that was the fundamental flaw in their model, and still today in many online retailers' model, they don't segment the market. Conversion is the key because people are ready to shop online. So you have 5.3 million people ready to shop, only 3.2 million are actually shopping. So you have 40% of the ready base who are waiting for you, the online retailer, to convert them. And then finally, the third one, confidence is actually the currency of online retail. And if you don't instill confidence in your shopper, you're actually undermining and devaluing your own currency. Thank you very much.